Well, welcome everybody to our conversation about the future of organisations. I'll just do a quick introduction. My name's Dr. Travis Kemp. I am a coaching and organisational psychologist, researcher, adjunct professor at University of South Australia, and wear a number of different hats in my professional life currently. My research area of interest has always been coaching psychology, organisational performance, and in particular individual performance as well. So much of my time at the present moment is spent in organisations working with C-suite leaders and enterprise leaders, supporting them in terms of their own growth and development, but also in terms of the way they go about managing in what is emerging as an exceptionally complex and unpredictable commercial environment for a lot of organisations. Today I wanted to share a few insights that we're developing around how organisations and individuals within them are coping within the pandemic environment, but also revisiting a few specific points that relate to how organisations function and individuals in particular within them function, and how in some respects, we've known a lot about that and understood a lot about that for a long period of time. And now it's probably more important than ever to start to apply that in a different way. Let me share some of my screen here so that you can start to get a sense of where we want to go in this conversation. Given the fact that we've got a short-ish amount of time, we'll stay fairly focused and fairly pointed in terms of some of the insights that we're extracting from the environment at the moment. One of the big challenges in being an organisational and coaching psychologist in organisations is that we cut across a very diverse range of industries and organisations themselves, and of course an incredibly diverse range of people. So, part of our role is to sometimes fit in with the people that we're working with, and when we come into organisations, we have to give a good impression sometimes of being a part of that organisation so that we can get an insight into it. And one of the interesting phenomenons that we're starting to see that this pandemic is surfacing is that some of our beliefs about what organisations are, how they function, and certainly how individuals maintain their own level of performance and ability to sustain that performance over time. Our beliefs around that versus what the evidence tells us are often quite different things. And so part of being a psychologist and being a scientist, I suspect, more broadly, is that some of the things that we deal with are not pleasant in terms of what the data is telling us and what we know about humans and how they think, learn, grow and develop. And when we apply those to organisational settings, sometimes they get some resistance. So we'll explore that just very briefly as we move through the slides today. Some broader thoughts that I would mind, if it's okay, sharing with you guys. What's happening in organisations right now, just at a very big picture level, and how that's playing out. What does that tell us about organisations and how they've been structured up until this point? And indeed, what they've been focusing on and trying and attempting to do for a while now that is being, I guess, being called into question in some respects in terms of its efficacy. What does that mean in terms of where we are with this specific pandemic and the impact that has on organisations, and what might we need to be doing specifically to respond to that? And will we take this notion of the current situation being an opportunity and a point in time, if you like, that provides us with a platform to fundamentally shift the way we see and think about organisations, how we build them, how we operate within them, how we construct them, and how we nurture and grow people within them. Because this point in time presents that opportunity, and it's my hope that we will use that opportunity and take that opportunity to really rethink how we construct our organisations and how they run. So what is happening in our organisations right now and how people are responding? Well, that's a very interesting question. And I think the best way to capture the diversity and the breadth of response from people in our organisations is to create a quick montage. And there you have it, folks. the broad range of responses of individuals within organizations. Bottom line is that people are responding in different ways and different levels of intensity, and they're having very, very unique and different experiences. And when we talk to people in organizations, their experiences range from, at one end of the spectrum, a great sense of opportunity, hope, and relief that, for example, working from the home office provides them. The great sense of functionality almost, and the great sense of performance and productivity that our lot are experiencing by working at home at one end of that spectrum. And at the opposite end of the spectrum, high levels of anxiety, high levels of, I guess, loss of productivity, sense of isolation, sense of, in the extreme end of that spectrum, sense of loss and grief. And certainly many people are experiencing that. Part of this challenge is operating and understanding that there is that breadth of diversity, that there are extremes to that continuum, and we all sit on that continuum at some sort of level and move up and down it. But what a lot of organizations and a lot of individuals have discovered as a result of this experience is that for a long while they've been, in a sense, boiling frogs. And what this opportunity presents is I guess, an artificial timeout to take ourselves out of that pot, look at the situation that we have called the norm up until this point, and reflect on whether that is really the way that we want to be working, the way that we want to be constructing organisations, the way that I guess is a sustainable and feasible way to construct our organisations and continuing to work. And a lot of people are starting to question that. So in an anecdotal sense, just from speaking to many leaders in many organisations over the past 3 months, and now coming to a point where those isolation restrictions are being lifted, organisations are asking their people, what is it and how is it that you want to be working? And what are your thoughts and desires and hopes about your return to the workplace, for example? And do you want to maintain a level of flexibility and adaptability around this way of working ongoing? And the really interesting feedback that a lot of organisations are getting at this point in time is that anything up to 90+%, depending on the industry and the organisation, of employees who are working from home and isolated want to continue to work from home and not return to the office. Now, there is a range of responses between 50 to 60% who want to maintain this level of flexibility around the way that they work. And as I said, extreme levels where in some organisations almost the entire population would prefer to work from home. So that tells us a lot about the state of organisations in some respects, the desire to want to get back to a place where in the past people have felt is probably suboptimal to their personal level of contribution and their level of productivity. That's something to keep in the back of our mind. When we start to look at the organisational and commercial environment more broadly, there are these competing demands which are being surfaced at the moment as well. So finding this balance between having individuals and the organisation itself flourish and flounder, and understand that we move along that continuum. How do we start to build organisations, and how do we start to create environments that are going to support people to sit towards the flourish end of that spectrum? There is that commercial constraint, which is the return versus the investment. So there are concerns now about how much is being invested in individuals and organisations and the return that should be expected and I guess aimed for in those sort of environments. The bottom line to commercial organisations is that the majority of them are in a commercial environment designed for profit. So where does that sit? What is a fair and reasonable expectation of what that profit looks like, and at what cost or investment does that profit come? And then there's that component of sustainability versus growth. And one of the big challenges that we face in organisations is an expectation of perpetual growth, that there will always be growth, especially in for example, the listed organisations there are expectations from the market of a continuing, almost linear and predictable sense of performance growth. And yet when we look at the evidence, very clear, peak performance requires periods of decline, rest, of non-performance, if that makes sense. Performance tends to travel in cycles. It doesn't tend to show up as a linear and progressively growing and expanding phenomenon. And so how do we build in a sense of tolerance and understanding that to try and maintain running the engine at 10,000 RPM constantly will mean that the longevity of that engine is compromised, that we need to be thinking about how we maintain, look after our resources, human and otherwise, for the longer term, so that we can continue to have organisations that stay flourishing and functional over a longer period of time. One of the broader challenges, though, that organisations face is that not only are we facing a pandemic, but we are grappling with this notion of technological change hitting an exponential curve. And we could talk quite extensively and for a long period of time over what that actually means in terms of organisational shift and change, and what that means in terms of personal well-being. Suffice to say that the technological rate of change at the moment is unprecedented. And we use that word very specifically because in its lack of precedence, we're talking about the fact that in a non-linear progressive growth of technology, in an exponential growth of technology, the ability to be able to predict the future becomes increasingly difficult. And as you can see with the technological change curve in this slide, once you start to near the vertical axis, the ability to be able to forward predict changes and the time frame around those changes becomes very, very challenged, if you like. And the speed and magnitude of change exponentially rises. So one of the big challenges for humans at this point in history is attempting to magnify and broaden their thinking in a way that we haven't been called upon in the past. So the speed of change, generally speaking, is rapidly increasing. The magnitude and impact of those changes is rapidly increasing. And when you compare that to our traditional systems, our social system, our business systems, and our political systems, they tend to lag quite significantly behind technological change, and they still continue to lag. So one of the big challenges is, how do I start to prepare myself for an organisational future that is largely difficult to predict, and certainly difficult to develop any sort of certainty of endpoint in that journey. When we start to look at how that is playing out in organisations, this is in some ways the concerning component of this, because we're already starting to see the human impact of this incredibly complex and unpredictable world that we're starting to grapple with. And what we're seeing in organisations at an individual level, and it's been highlighted by the experience of isolation in the pandemic, is that levels of engagement have tended to be falling. We certainly see deterioration in individuals' mental health in organisations at the moment, and so from a societal perspective more broadly as well. With the pandemic specifically, the effect of isolation for a lot of people and the environment in which they're isolated has a big impact on their mental health. And we're starting to see levels of anxiety and depression start to kick up now. We're starting to see levels of stress, generally speaking, emerge. And this notion of cultural toxicity starts to be hinted at with people's lack of willingness, or at least excitement, or in some ways energy to move back into the work environment. Very clearly there are reasons why people don't want to go back into the work environment, and that is something that we're grappling with at the moment and need to really understand. When you look at it more broadly in terms of social impacts of anxiety and depression, the numbers are quite significant. Just focusing and reminding people that, you know, 1 in 5 and 1 in 8 men are likely to experience depression now in their lifetime. And certainly those numbers are even more significant for anxiety, 1 in 3 women, 1 in 5 men. And at the moment, at any given point in time, you know, anything up to 2 million people or more are suffering from anxiety. So this is a really interesting challenge as we start to look at organisations and people within it, because if this is what's happening in broader society, you know, organisations are of themselves a microcosm of that society. We should expect to be grappling with this phenomenon internal to organisations as well. It's a massive challenge in organisations where we are constantly striving to attain goals and to set stretch goals and objectives, that we are expected in organisations to continuously exceed those goals in some respects. And what we're learning more about that process of perpetual goal setting, goal attainment, and goal striving, remembering that you know, even the most effective and high performing individuals within organisations eventually get to a point where continually setting, achieving and attaining goals becomes problematic. And some of the research, as we're seeing here, that's emerging now, is that even when I am successful at achieving those goals, that perpetual and relentless pace of resetting goals and achieving goals in and of itself is unsustainable at an individual personal health perspective level. And what we're seeing is that depression appears to be an override system, that when I'm constantly striving towards and attaining goals, I am, if in effect, my system says to me, we will step in here and we will shut you down. If you don't want to shut yourself down, if you don't want to take a break, if you don't want to recover, if you don't want to you know, take a breath, if you like, we will do that for you. And so what we're saying is that depression in and of itself seems to be a mechanism of forcing you to disengage from this notion of unattainable perpetual goals. So it's something to be aware of when we start to talk about flourishing and positive applied coaching, for example, in organisations, becoming much more aware of the need to not only have conversations around goal setting, goal attainment and goal striving, but also have restorative-based conversations, wellness-based conversations, conversations that focus on the things that I need to do to maintain my mood and my own well-being and my sense of flourishing rather than floundering. Again, managing my point on that continuum. You know, the other thing that seems to come out in organisations too is this strive for perfectionism, this espoused pursuit of getting things right and getting things right perfectly and all the time. Almost to the point where that sort of behaviour is reinforced, strengthened and rewarded in some organisations. And it's very vitally important now at this point in time that we start to recognise and see that perfectionism in and of itself has an adverse effect on humans in multiple ways. Perfectionism in and of itself is a form of anxiety. And what we see in the pursuit of perfectionism is that that pursuit actually has an adverse effect on self-esteem and sense of self-efficacy. It certainly leads to increases of you know, perceived and experienced anger, depression, anxiety. We see that, you know, the striving towards perfectionism raises the tendency for individuals to be hypercritical and I guess destructive with one another. And certainly we start to see burnout. We're seeing that in organisations more and more as well. So organisations in some respects are in a quite a challenging state at this point in time. It's also important to remind ourselves, if you like, in our organisations and the people within them, that perfectionism is, in some ways, you know, self-abuse, and the continual pursuit of a theoretical state that is evident from an evidence-based perspective unattainable is a dangerous pursuit. The other thing that we need to be aware of in this process is our inherent level of cognitive bias that all humans suffer from, and that, you know, there are 188 plus of them that we know, and that we are victim to, just as a result of being humans ourselves. One of the things that gets in the way of change and growth through, you know, challenging times that organisations and individuals within them are facing at the moment are these biases that distort the way that we're seeing the situation, distort the way we see ourselves and how we act. Just wanted to give a couple of examples of those that are playing out very strongly at the moment. This notion of confirmation bias. We tend to search for evidence that confirms our beliefs about people and situations. In the old way of working, the assumption, for example, that I needed to be face-to-face with you to have a conversation or a meeting that was effective, the assumption that I needed to see you or be in your vicinity as your manager to make sure that you were working, persists very strongly at the moment. Again, very little evidence for that, but the belief that unless I could see you, I could be near you and I could observe you working, the chances are that you wouldn't be working is a very, very strong belief that continues to be held even in the face of contrary evidence, which we're gathering now very strongly and very clearly, that people can function and produce and are diligent and dutiful and get things done in remote situations. So we need to be aware of these biases that are going to get in the way of us being able to make transformations in our organisations. We tend to persevere with those beliefs even when there's contradictory evidence. And again, you know, the tendency to discount the evidence that humans are inherently very productive, very diligent, very dutiful in most cases, even when they're isolated and in control of the way they spend their own time, is an important reminder for us to all start to reconsider our position in that regard. When you start to look at other biases are playing out as well. False consensus effect is one of those. People tend to overestimate the degree to which others agree with them, and they readily guess their own opinions or beliefs and predictions to be more prevalent in the general public than they really are. You know, people tend to believe that others believe what they believe more than what they actually believe. And they tend to believe what they think is more widely believed by other people than what it actually is. And in organisations that assume that, you know, individuals really need to be in an office and to be in the same vicinity of others in the organisation to be effective, really tend to assume that other people are believing that as well. Now, that's a very unsafe assumption. And certainly, as I said before, what we're learning in this pandemic is that the rules for how we construct and physically manage organisations are up for grabs, and we can learn a lot from this. Another one that tends to come up in the current situation is this behavioural confirmation bias. You know, over time, people begin to behave as you expect them to behave. Now, if you expect your individuals in organisations to be untrustworthy, for example, to not work unless they are in a work environment, for them, if the assumption is that, you know, if I'm not watching you, then you won't be doing the right thing. If the expectation of people is that, and you continue to hang on to that belief, then over time, people tend to start behaving in that way. This is a particularly dangerous situation for us at the moment, because if we hold on to those beliefs, that if you're remote working or you're working flexibly, you're not really working, then over time, people will give into that and start to, I guess, compromise their own integrity and question whether they do want to remain engaged and productive. There's a theme that we'll come back to around trust, which is vitally important at this point in time. So one of the things that I guess we arrive at is this position that if organisations are going to transform, that we need to be taking our head out of the sand around what we already know and what we're learning now about how humans function and how they maintain their level of performance and well-being in organisations. And we really need to start to look at the evidence rather than the hearsay. One of those elements is that, you know, great leaders and I guess, influential managers really start to reflect on themselves, if that makes sense. They start from this position of reflecting on, how am I showing up in the world? They're starting to reflect on, what does this mean for me? How do I need to change myself in relation to this new situation? How do I need to be showing up for my people who are isolated, for example, differently to what I may have been in the past? Now, that requires a level of commitment to introspection. And I can tell you that it's a very, very difficult process sometimes, to introspect. And looking in the mirror can be an incredibly confronting process. And looking into mirrors is incredibly energy draining at times. But one of the things that is vitally important is that we do start to introspect as leaders in organisations, and we do start to look at how we ourselves are influencing the organisation's propensity to rethink how it works and how it will use this opportunity to position and structure itself for success and sustainability in the future. So what good organisations and their leaders are doing now is starting to stretch this notion of trust and starting to really look at what trust looks like. And more importantly, what the depth and level of trust is in the organisation currently, and what the current situation is telling us about that. And traditionally, people in organisations have run, generally speaking, what we would call an earned trust model. So I make a small agreement with you, you keep that agreement with me, I put a little trust coin in my pocket, and then I make another little agreement with you and see whether you keep that, and you'll keep that, and I'll keep another little trust coin in my pocket. And over time, I build up this sense, this bank account of trust, if you like. And it's built up with these little interactions where we make agreements and we both deliver on each other's expectations. Now, there's a lot of upside to that model, and for a lot of people, that's a very beautiful and sensible and rational and risk mitigated way of building trust. And unfortunately, it takes a long time. It takes an enormous amount of effort in some respects. And in some respects, also, when little things go wrong, they can have massive impacts. So when people let us down, for example, that bank account very quickly gets withdrawn. And it doesn't take too many times where people let us down for that bank account to be emptied out completely. In the new world, if you like, in the future of organisations, in a more holistic and flexible and, I guess, adaptable organisation, we just don't have the time and the proximity and, I guess, in some respects, the historical context to be able to build trust in that way. And so what the most radical and the most progressive leaders are starting to embrace much more now, the most impactful leaders in a lot of respects, is this sense of granted trust. So assuming good intent, assuming that people are trustworthy, assuming that when you give them autonomy and when you give them accountability and when you empower them and when you build in, if you like, flexibility to the way they do that, when we start to develop a relationship with each other, and that trust is assumed rather than having to be earned, what we're seeing is that performance of individuals is improving, the level of engagement improves, the quality of the psychological contract that exists between employer and employee is improved. We see that people start to actually produce higher quality outputs. And this is a very interesting phenomenon. In some ways, it's counterintuitive. And what's required of leaders to step into that space, what's required of them to start to build culture and organisations that are based on trust, is an enormous amount of courage to let go of the sense of need for control, to let go of what I would call the illusion of control, to understand the anxiety that I feel with not having direct line of sight over you, for example, but trusting and empowering and supporting you to be successful, by structuring your own day in your own way to get what we've agreed needs to be done. These are, again, these are leadership challenges for me as an individual, and my own propensity to want to control my external environment versus focusing on how I'm responding to this ambiguity and how I manage myself in it. Because when we start to look at what great leaders and great organizations are encouraging, we're starting to see that, you know, great leadership is fundamentally about an alliance, as is great coaching. And when we start to look at, you know, how leaders become coaches and how we demonstrate positive psychology through positive coaching by leaders in organizations, we start to see that they do start, if you take a look at this model, from the position of introspection, understanding myself and how that impacts on the environment. And then from this point in time, you know, reflecting on what that means in terms of the way I show up, the way that I impact on others. What does it mean in terms of how I need to be aware of my strengths and my liabilities, and how is it that I need to look after my own well-being to be at my best for others? Once I start to do that, I can start to manage myself a little bit more effectively, and I can start to share more authentically with others as to who I am, what I want to achieve, what I want to create, and what the organisation is becoming, and what we collectively want to build it as in the future. And then once I get to that point, I can invite you into that conversation without fear of conflict necessarily, or of resistance. I can create a dialogue which is mutually respectful and is much more inclusive in terms of the process. And once I get to that point, once I develop that relationship between myself and my follower, between the leader and the follower, then that alliance, if you like, that leadership alliance is built, and that relationship that emerges from that process that started with me just taking a long hard look at myself looks like this shared sense of trust, shared sense of respect and empathy. You know, we can collectively build meaning and purpose and commitment from that level of trust and mutual respect. And once I do that, once I create that dialogue, which allows me to be collaboratively creative with you, that's where the engagement comes from. That's where I feel this sense of alignment, and I feel this sense of autonomy, and I can really get a sense that I can make a contribution to building this environment, building this relationship, being successful in this organization. And that has very little to do with the bricks and mortar and the control systems that are placed in the organization from a structural perspective. It's very much about the relationship. So as my engagement in this process and in this relationship and the organization increases, I start to look for new opportunities to co-create different futures. You know, I start to feel and contribute and receive, you know, support in terms of the action that I'm wanting to contribute towards that. And that's where we get the individual and organizational growth from. And this pandemic has surfaced a lot of insight around how humans are traveling in organizations. But if there's one thing that it's focused on and it's serviced, is that the way things have been working and occurring up until this point have not necessarily been sustainable. And they're not necessarily the way that people want it to be in the future. And as a result of that, we are going to need to rethink how organizations are built, how they're managed, how they're structured, and how they grow, develop, and sustain themselves over time. And that process of reflection and using the data and the evidence that we have about how humans perform at their best, for example, how they maintain their wellness, how they collectively strive towards goals, how they work with each other to achieve those goals. As we start to apply that evidence and what we know about that to the purposeful and considered building and growing of organizations, we potentially can build much more effective and resilient organizations for the future in a world that is very, very unpredictable. So on that note, I'd like to say thank you for allowing me to share that. I hope that the conference has been fantastic to you. If you have any questions about this, please feel free to get in touch. There are certainly many opportunities for conversations, many unknowns, and many questions that we can grapple with. So I'll be delighted to respond to any questions that you have. Again, have a wonderful conference for the rest of your time that you spend here, and I wish you all the best.